and welcome to Boards Today, a Radio Entrepreneurs production. I'm producer Jillian King, and I'm excited to share the Spring 2026 Boards Today panel. In this discussion, we will explore different facets of boards for public and private business, delving into the details and breaking down the boardroom. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Steve Snyder, partner and entrepreneur in residence at Gesmer Updegrove; Martin Lowenthal, macroeconomic life and financial advisor to business owners with the Bulfinch Group; and Scott Levy, senior advisor at DLA, who could not join us today. We wish him luck in the state doubles tennis semifinals. We're joined today by special guest Mark Shirman, CEO of Approved Contact. Approved Contact offers a platform that lets businesses send and manage text messages from their existing work numbers inside tools like Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and RingCentral. I'm now going to turn things over to one of our hosts, David Rubinstein, CEO of OptiRTC, to tell you more about Mark. David?
Thanks, Jillian. I'm very excited to introduce Mark Shirman today. Mark and I go way back. We co-founded a company in 1985 that hit the Gartner Group list as one of the top boutique system integration firms in the U.S. We pulled off an IPO together back in 2000 around the dot-com bubble. And since then, Mark's career has just jettisoned multiple board roles, advisory roles, investors, and other startups. So Mark is here. He can give us a 360-degree view of really what goes on with boards and how important they are for small businesses. So really look forward to today's discussion. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our co-host, JDavis, the founder of Mage Consulting and Radio Entrepreneurs. Jeffrey, take it away.
Thank you. And, guys, I can really appreciate this topic. I think one of the most valuable tools leaders, entrepreneurs, and families have had in business are boards and boards of advisors. I'm sure Mark would agree with that. When you think about the cost of professionals, when you create a board and you really create it properly, utilize it properly, it can be invaluable for the business and for the family, whatever is using it to grow the business. So Mark, let's just start with an easy softball for you. For me, when is the best time for a business to be looking at starting a board or a board of directors?
Hey, first of all, thanks for having me on board. I think it's sort of bifurcated in the type of business that you are. So if you are a business that's brought on investors, they'll pretty much demand you to have a board right away. You need to have the investors on, and it's a very different kind of board than if you're a private company or you haven't taken in any significant capital. So I'll address the latter, because the first one is you're going to have one right away. Secondly, I would do it as early as you can, but it can be a very flexible and dynamic team of people that you put together. You want to surround yourself with folks that are going to be open and honest and also balance off the pros and cons of what you're good at. It's just like any other entrepreneurial effort where it's really about building teams. How do you build a team that will support each other and make up for deficiencies and other things that come together with a team? The same as with a board, and even more important, people who you will listen to, that you should listen to, that will be open and honest and even say when the emperor has no clothes. I would say usually that's not sort of strategic on what you do with a business, but people to bounce ideas off of. If you have to build a team of people who tell you what to do with your business, you're probably the wrong guy in charge or the wrong person in charge. And if it's just looking at the numbers, also the same, but maybe looking at the numbers in a very different way, because obviously if you're too close to everything, you tend to spin things in your own mind. We all do, and everything we do. And getting an honest opinion from the outside makes sense. So I would start right away. If you're starting a business, pull in a bunch of people. Depending upon the type of business, it can be as formal as you want, and it can start small and continue to grow.
At that early stage, Mark, should the owner consider a board of advisors initially or a board of directors?
Great question. I actually would more defer to board of advisors. My world, and I've put a bunch of board of advisors together. I serve on a bunch right now. I always tell the entrepreneurs that it's more about business development than it is about what you should do and how you should run your business. You bring in board of advisory folks who have big networks who can help the business together, generally getting business for you and getting input for the business or creating partnerships. And that can evolve to a much more formal board of directors.
Well, it sounds like that would be a good way to sort of flesh it out before you get into it formally to figure out how it works and build the structure that works for the company. I was going to throw it back at Martin because you said one of my favorite words that always triggers me to think of Martin, and that was emperor wears no clothes, because he's really good at spotting that stuff and calling you out. So sorry, Martin, did you have a thought when he said that?
I did, because I've had a lot of experience at the angel level, personally and then professionally, and they don't like it when you have to set them straight. So, or when you call the BS.
Exactly. And you know what? You need to be strong enough as an entrepreneur to get an honest answer from people. If everybody's going to yes you, you're not getting anything from the team and you're not going to evolve as a business. None of us know all the answers, and it's good to get poked at. You can take advice or not take their advice, but it's important to be sort of open and honest.
Yeah, got to keep them from what I'll call style drift, of going off the reservation and not focusing on the business.
Agreed. One thing I'd add about the board of advisory groups, what I've often seen is folks that use up their value in the first 6 or 8 months that they're on the board. You really don't want a bunch of people. You don't want a bunch of people who are just collecting honorariums, whether it's cash or whether it's stock, or not. And if they can add value, you want to make sure you're continually to revisit that value on an ongoing basis. And that's part of being an entrepreneur, which is continuing to evolve your teams. There's nothing more important, whether it's your operating team or your advisory or board of directors. You want to continue to evaluate it. That's the most important. I lecture on entrepreneurship at one of the local universities, and you have a lot of kids out there who think they can create the next great app and that's going to take them to the next spot. Maybe it will. I always talk about resiliency, and I always talk about team building. It's the most important thing.
Well, you mentioned something again. I always say to my wife, my problem is not that I don't listen, it's that I do listen. And I think you were talking about holding people accountable. And I think that that's a part of boards that I don't see enough of. And that is setting the goals and holding people accountable, doing reviews. So I don't know if anybody in this room, I know that's stuff that Steve comes across a lot also in his experiences, building that component in performance. And performance attainment is is more important with the board as anyone else in an organization.
Totally agree. So I can give you several examples where I've set up advisory boards for entrepreneurs. I may be paid a nominal fee, or it may be stock. Usually I set up the boards where there's some amount of stock that vests, usually in an accelerated time period over employees. But we evaluate it on a 6-month basis. We end up having calls no less than quarterly. And I take a look at who's adding value and who's not. And if they're not, you have an uncomfortable conversation and you move along.
Anybody in this room ever ask somebody to get off a board?
I've tried, but I will say that this is a very good discipline I haven't heard about from others, and I'm curious, what is it like when you see those signals where somebody's on the board and they're just not contributing?
I think I'm going to jump in.
Okay.
Particularly with a board of advisors that is created typically in earlier stage companies, smaller companies, chemistry is so important. Chemistry with other advisors, and particularly with the founder, chemistry is critically important. And while the founder may think there's chemistry over the first month or two, as they get more involved with the board, it may become obvious that there isn't the right chemistry to go forward. And yes, that's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but because it's a board of advisors and not a board of directors where they have fiduciary obligations, it's much easier to say to someone, we really appreciate all of the value you've created, but we'd like to bring a different person on board with a different background, different experiences. So I think it's an easier conversation to have as part of a board of advisors.
Yeah.
No question. The board of advisors is a lot more flexibility. I have been in situations with board of directors. In fact, I've offered to resign from board of directors where I was the independent, and I was brought in by a CEO who might have exited or might have been fired, might have whatever. And I wanted to make sure that the CEO had the opportunity to build a board that they could believe in, whether they were bringing in their buddies or another investor or whatever. You know, a lot of these things are learned, right? It's just, you get the stuff from experience by making so many bad decisions through the early parts of your career. And you're just like, okay, I don't want to do this again. I know how this movie goes, but you know, and in those situations where I have resigned, and it was good board, and they were venture-backed companies, and again, I was independent, bringing stuff to the table. When I can't add any more value, I'm going to leave. It's in the best interest of the CEO, and we all know on this panel here that it's a long career with lots of different pluses and minuses, and you got to look at it that way.
You know, Mark, I'm not used to hearing board members who self-regulate. I mean, usually they have to be regulated by a party on the board, and maybe you want to sort of talk about that. There has to be those checks and balances to make sure that the board does not become a networking place or a place of opportunity for the wrong people.
I totally agree. And it needs to be both of those things, right? It needs to be a networking thing. It needs to add value. It needs to do all that. That's some of the encouragement of bringing people on to a board as well. I get to work with other people that are peer groups. I get to network, but they're not adding value back to the company. It's the CEO or the management team's responsibility to make sure they're getting, whether it's a board of advisors or whether it's a board of directors, they need to do that. Obviously, way harder when you have investors at the table. And of course, the extra dynamic with the investors is the different personalities of the investors. You know, I ran a business that had a lot of venture in, including strategic. So I had observers in, and there was one very heavy personality. It wasn't necessarily the biggest investor, but a very heavy personality, and controlled the boardroom in not from a negative operating way for me, but in general. Based upon the cult of personality, if you will. He literally would come in with his man purse and take out his nail clippers and start clipping nails in the middle of the board meeting. I don't know about you guys, but
Martin, I told you not to do that.
No. I've told you never to repeat that story.
Somebody pull out an electric shaver once. That was special.
Well, you know, I was once on a board where someone was self-dealing. You know, I'll help you do this if I get that. And it was time to take that person off the board. No self-dealing.
yeah, and that, you know, it's a little bit of collaboration. It's a little bit of Machiavelli. It's a little bit of all those things in order to get going. But as a management team or as a leader of a management team, it's your responsibility to look out for that most of all, which should be then looking out for yourself.
Well, David, I think we have to turn it over to Jillian. And I want to remind everybody there'll be a second segment coming. Jillian?
Thank you, Jeffrey. And thank you, everyone. That wraps up part 1 of this spring 2026 edition of Boards Today. Thank you to all our listeners and viewers who have tuned in for this first segment on Radio Entrepreneurs. Be sure to check out part 2 and part 3 of this discussion to hear more, and click subscribe or follow to stay up to date on all our postings as they go live. If you're a fan of our videos, please be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and press the bell button. Radio Entrepreneurs is also active on LinkedIn, so be sure to follow our page there as well for more business advice and discussions. Until next time, thanks for listening. We'll be back with more stories on Radio Entrepreneurs.